All right, let's look at the Dave and Todd scenarios and see if they don't give us some idea of kind of where we fall down in terms of free will and our moral responsibility. And one of the first things we'll recognize is that moral responsibility in one sense is kind of like an on-off switch, right? It either exists in a particular situation or it doesn't. Um, but then if it does, then it becomes a matter of degree. And we're going to start realizing that the degree of moral responsibility that somebody bears for a particular action is going to depend on the circumstances in which the action took place. And in going through these scenarios and doing that assessment of the circumstances, it'll start to clarify for you what your values are. Right? What is important to you when you're assessing the ways that people live and what they do while living? What is of value to you? All right, so scenario number one. Dave's got this undiagnosed brain tumor, and it causes his arm to spasm one day when he's out hunting with his friend Dave, and he uncontrollably pulls the trigger and kills his friend Todd. And so the question is, all right, is Dave morally responsible? Did he do something wrong in this case? And we would clarify at the beginning, we say, well, Dave is definitely the cause of Todd's death, but did he do something wrong in causing it? Are we responsible for putting some amount of condemnation on Dave for what he's done? And so you're probably going to go at a couple of things here. You're going to say, was it really undiagnosed? Did Dave really not know he had this brain tumor? Yes. Okay. So Dave had no knowledge that he had this brain tumor. And then your next question is going to be something like, okay, but did he have this history of spasming before? Like, had he ever experienced these kind of uncontrolled spasms? And you'd be asking questions like this because you're trying to assess how in control was Dave of his decision-making as he went into this scenario with the rifle? If he had had a history of uncontrolled muscle spasming and thought, cool, I'm down for hunting, then we'd be like, dude, not cool. That would be like somebody who has narcolepsy getting in a car and then running somebody over when they fall asleep at the wheel. We'd say, we know you didn't mean to run over that person while you were driving and asleep. But that was irresponsible for you to get in the car knowing your medical condition. So we're just going to work from the assumption here that Dave had no knowledge of his brain tumor and he had no history of any kind of spasms. In other words, Dave had no way to anticipate that he would experience this event that was completely out of his control. So that now, under those circumstances, would you assign any blame to Dave? And most people are going to say no. Okay, they're going to say no. Dave couldn't have helped but do this. In fact, in some way, Dave is a victim here too. He's going to have to live the rest of his life knowing that he was the cause of his friend's death, even though he didn't intend to do that. So it's a real tragedy, right? But we're probably not going to blame Dave. We're probably going to have to work to ensure that Dave doesn't blame himself. Usually that's how folks fall down on this. A few years ago, I had a student who just was like unmoved. And he was like, nope, Dave's morally responsible. We can blame him. And I'm like, dude, you're a gangster, man. That's hardcore to heap that kind of blame on somebody who couldn't help doing what they're doing. Now consider scenario number two, right? Now it's not that Dave has an uncontrolled brain tumor, or I'm sorry, an undiagnosed brain tumor. Now he is suffering from a severe mental illness, post-traumatic stress disorder that he has gotten after serving in a war for 2 tours. And he wakes up out of a blackout, kind of doesn't know where he is. He's hallucinating. He thinks that his friend Todd sitting there is an enemy. And out of an impulse to self-defense, Dave shoots Todd. In other words, this isn't an uncontrolled pull of the trigger. This is an intentional pull of the trigger. And he's pulling the trigger, though, based on kind of a lie, right? His brain is kind of lying to him. He's hallucinating. He thinks that Todd is someone he's not. Do we blame Dave in this case? And again, you're probably going back to, well, it depends. You know, this kind of reminds me of situations where, like, a child comes home late at night unexpectedly, and the parent in the house thinks that it's a burglar and shoots the kid, you know, and is horrified by this. And so we're going to have to assess, like, well, what would a reasonable person do, right? And then we get into this reasonable person standard. And you probably want to know things like, well, did Dave know he had PTSD? And we'd be like, yeah, he probably knew it. He at least knew he was different than when he went to war. And he knew that he was having these hallucinatory experiences. And so then we might say, like, well, damn, then Dave should have gotten himself to a doctor so that they could prescribe him meds. And so we're starting to move into this area where, like, I think that Dave bears some level of responsibility for what he did because he didn't take the precautions that a sensible, reasonable person would take when they're suffering from this condition that causes them to sort of detach from reality and become a danger to others. And then we'd have to factor in, well, that's kind of the nature of PTSD. It's this really insidious mental illness where the illness tells you don't go to the doctor. Don't go around people who are going to try to make you, quote unquote, better. Right? That's one of the insidious things about PTSD, is it actually compels you to flee the help that would actually make you better. All right, so then you start factoring all of this in. Where do you fall down? Would you say that Dave did a wrong thing when he was hallucinating? Would you say that Dave did a bad thing? We know it's tragic, but should we kind of heap some blame on Dave? Should we heap his blame to the degree that we send him off to jail or make him pay money to Todd's family? What about this scenario? Number 3. Dave's totally normal, gentle, no undiagnosed brain tumor, no PTSD, but he gets hypnotized by an evil psychiatrist and orders him to kill Todd, and Dave does it while he's in a hypnotic trance. Again, you're probably like, well, does hypnotism really work that way? Does hypnotism make people do things that they wouldn't otherwise do? Is it possible to control the mind of somebody else? Right? Oh God, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. But there's a great, not conspiracy. I mean, it is a conspiracy in the sense that people conspired together, but the federal government conspired with medical organizations back in the 1960s in the Haight-Ashbury of San Francisco to engage in these experiments where they wanted to see if they could figure out a way to reorder somebody's moral reasoning skills without them knowing it and get them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. But COINTELPRO worked on this. There's a great book by Tom O'Neill called Chaos, if you're interested in this, and it covers the Manson family and all this stuff. How the hell did I go off on that tangent? All right. So in this situation here, again, the degree of moral responsibility that we place on Dave is going to be probably correlated to how much credence we put in hypnosis to change the way that people behave. And we might, if we really believe in hypnosis, and we really think that a hypnotist can get somebody to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do, and take over somebody's will, then we might shift the blame over to the evil psychiatrist and say, you use Dave as a tool to do something really bad that you intended as a psychiatrist, that Dave in no way intended to do. So we absolve Dave of moral responsibility in this case, and we put moral responsibility on the evil psychiatrist. All right, so we'll look at some more scenarios coming up here.